Welcome to Varn.
Thank you. Happy to be back.
And
It's been a long time since I've been on. It's been good. It's good to be back.
Yeah, it's been almost like a year and a half, 2 years, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I think so. Since the book came out.
Yeah. The book, which I literally called the wrong name for an entire show and realized it at the last minute. I think it was, what does that call it? Borderlines or Borderlands? I can't remember which one.
Borderlines, and we were calling it Borderlands. Myself included. You had me saying it.
Right. Which is funny because I was just like, I should have just remembered the Cindy Lauper song. It would have like stayed in my head the entire time. But anyway, I'm here with them, Melo, and we are talking immigration now. 3 years into the Biden administration, and things look both very different and very much the same than when we talked last time. In our discussions off air, I mentioned to you, it seemed like we got about 3 to 6 months of like some brief immigration discussion reforms. A bunch of amnesties were granted to like people who were in churches, stuff like that. And then as soon as it got hard at all, you had Harris going down to the border to, I believe, Guatemala to talk about the migrant caravans, and then border policy took a hard reversal back to Trump era norms. At the very beginning, I remember liberals like trying to spin this to where they were saying like, oh, this is not this, it's not as in, yes, there are similar policies to Trump, but it's not as inhumane. But after about a year, you just heard people basically shut up about it. There was like an active attempt not to cover it. And it really did seem very similar to the way anti-war stuff went with mainstream Democrats through the first Obama admin, that there was an attempt to like bury this element, and that while, you know, dedicated activists, you know, not just socialist ones, have still been taking it seriously, by and large, a lot of their larger NGO support structures or media coverage has completely gone away. So, you know, with that being my understanding, first of all, do you agree with me?
Yeah, no, so like to just like do a quick 3-year recap, right? So like you said, right, like initially Biden, you know, sort of started to deliver on some of the easy rollbacks of, you know, some of the restrictions at the border, was actively, you know, trying to get rid of some of the more, like you said, inhumane policies. And then and also like you said, once things got hard, right, like once the numbers picked up, especially after, you know, COVID slowed down, and things like Title 42, which was the public health law that they were using to bounce people, not even like process them through the system, but immediately turn folks around. You know, once that stuff stopped being a viable means of sort of avoiding the topic in any meaningful way for the Dems, yeah, things just went full tilt the other direction, to where, you know, Biden has since, like, the administration has reinstituted a lot of the like asylum bans and requirements to like seek asylum in countries on your way to the US, and using that as a grounds to keep people out. You know, we've gotten the Department of Justice has just like hook, line, and sinker bought that same sort of approach of like litigating again. You know, so there's been a number of Supreme Court cases that the administration could have readily like either stepped aside or at least not fought so vigorously, that would have been, you know, boons for you know, at least smaller groups of immigrants, have consistently defended Trump era policies and laws in the court system quietly, right, but done it all the same. And the weird thing that's happening now, right, is that they actually are getting a little bit of a boost from these like Republican, we should talk about this too, of like states taking stuff into their own hands now. So you've got, you know, Abbott in Texas and DeSantis in Florida, them putting on these like, you know, show stunts gives the Democrats a little bit of a scapegoat, right? Because then we can turn the discussion away from what the fuck are we going to do about the border, about migration, about the system, and instead just talk about how awful Abbott is for putting, which it is awful, right? Like putting buoys with saws in the water in the Rio Grande, or DeSantis, you know, and all the anti-immigrant legislation that's been passed in Florida, or even shipping migrants to New York, right? Those things all, at least for now, take the attention away from the bigger problem, which is that nobody has a fucking solution for what's happening right now. And so, other than, you know, reverting back to the kind of very hard restrictionist policies.
I've thought a lot about that, about the way that you've seen this use of Abbott in particular, but also DeSantis's stunts, and a lot of them are stunts, to distract from the fact that, like, there's been a large concession to Trump era policies. And I mean, and it's a political theater that benefits both sides, because, you know, these figures like Abbott and DeSantis can pretend that they are pushing back on a liberal president who's liberalizing Trump era immigration policies, when in reality, like, most of Biden's immigration policies are more or less identical to Trump's. There's, you know, a couple of small things. And so that benefits their side, so they can make them sound like, you know, they're more harsh than they are. And who knows, maybe like in a second Trump administration, the second Trump administration will be more harsh. But what I've actually, the pattern actually has been historically the other way around, that immigration is actually tends to be harsher under a Democratic president, because the Democrats take more heat on it when they aren't harsh, and immigration seems to be attempted to be harsh under a Republican president, but they also get more pushback from their base. Now, and these are all post 2004 concerns. I do want to point out that longue durée trends are actually very different. But what's interesting to me is, I want to get what you think about this before we come back to Abbott and DeSantis, because in some ways, Abbott and DeSantis are real big problems, but they're also obvious, right? Like, what I've seen is all these pundits really shift. So, like Fareed Zakaria, for example, a year into the Biden administration, even a year and a half into the Biden administration, as soon as inflation hit, he started pushing Biden on being too harsh on immigration, because if we allowed more, he literally would say this on air, that we allowed more cheap labor in from Latin America, that it would actually be a wage suppressant and it would fight inflation, which wages is only like at most 1% of inflation anyway, but whatever. That was his theory, and he was actually stating it openly. But very recently, I've seen him call for a total ban on asylum seekers. Another person like Peter Zion, kind of a liberal interventionist of the center variety, has also, you know, and he will say that, like, oh no, Biden policies are basically Trump's. He'll say that out loud, but then he'll also say something like, well, the reason why Biden's are essentially the same as Trump is actually this is popular with the unions, or something like that. So there's been a move of liberal pundits, on one hand, to attack Abbott and DeSantis legitimately, and on the other hand, to actually try to, like, move from being to the left of Biden on immigration to the right of Biden on immigration, which I can only think is triangulation, so people don't notice that, like, the Biden administration has really moved away from any commitment it may have from progressives. And when people go, oh, progressives aren't very popular, yes, you are right. I talk about that all the time. But what is interesting about this is this has been corresponded directly with the ability of Republicans to pick up the Latin vote. Like, we have seen a marked increase in people being willing to lean Republican on the Latin vote. Now, I want to point out that between 1980 and 2004, the Latin vote was Republican anyway, and I think most people don't know that, but it's a kind of truth, and it wasn't just the Cubans. only basically like left Chicanos in the Southwest, particularly the West Coast,
Right.
in the Southwest, were particularly left wing before the aughts, and that's because opinions on immigration were about 50-50 in both parties, whether liberalizing or conservatizing at any given time. When Bush pushes for immigration reform in his second term, there's this great conservatizing move and shift in the GOP, and I think people think this has been the long DeRay case. It's not. It's a relatively recent move. That and also Barack Obama's particular ethnic concerns seem to have pushed the Latin vote squarely into the Democratic Party, and it has remained there until relatively recently. It is still true that the majority of Latin individuals in the United States vote Democratic, but what I find interesting is that majority is getting thinner and thinner, literally by the month. So what I can't tell is this partly because, I guess we're going to speculate on why there's cynicism here. Is this partly because the Democrats have given up on like the BIPOC vote, or at least the POC part of the BIPOC vote as part of their base, and because every current demographic indicator actually says that they're growing primarily amongst college-educated white people, or is it that like there's been such a demoralization because of lack of inaction on the Democrats' part that like, and the Democrats don't see an electoral way, they're just kind of willing to risk it? Is it both? Is it like, what do you think's going on there?
My like, again, just reading tea leaves, like my sense is that it is a bit of both, though probably more heavily the latter, because I feel like in watching how they've kind of squirmed under the current, stresses on the immigration system, is that, I mean, for starters, right, like if you were to grant amnesty tomorrow, right, which is not going to happen, but like assuming, right, that you could get Congress to do it, that group of people doesn't have any voting power. They don't right now, and they wouldn't probably under any version of amnesty. So what does that actually win you electorally? Nothing, or very little, right? Except maybe some goodwill from, family, from, the people who were already voting for them on the hope that they were going to do something anyway, right? So I guess like in a way, I think that they've just given up on the idea that this is a winning electoral move to like take a hard stance here in any kind of pro immigration capacity. And then, then the flip of that then becomes, it's like, okay, well then if there's not much to win, there's a hell of a lot to lose when the Republicans are able, and the conservatives are able to ride that train so hard of like, this is what's destroying, that nonsense, right? Of like what's tearing the country down is all of this, all these migrant flows from South America and Central America. So yeah, I just think that they've never had a positive program around immigration, and tinkering around the edges, like Obama passing DACA, that kind of thing, right, might have given them a little bit of an electoral boost for a while, but now the backlash seems so intense that I wonder if they're just like, this just isn't a winner for us, so we're going to pick something else.
I suspect that that's a large part of it. It's like with climate change, and actually I want to tie these two things together, but like if climate change has a really perverse thing, say you do all you need to do to stop climate change, there's going to be plausible deniability that it was ever a threat because you took out the threat. And let's say you don't do anything about it, well, then it might be a mess for the other side to clean up. And there's all kinds of perverse incentives right now, and progressive and liberal talking points. Like, for example, after Dodds, I don't really see there to be a strong move to nationally re-legalize abortion, because now they have this as a motivator in red states. And yes, they might move to re-legalize it in specific states on a state-by-state basis, but they're not going to move to like fix the Supreme Court or any of that, because it's actually not in their electoral strategy interest to do so. And that's something that is interesting about the Dobbs decision that I'm pretty cynical about, right? But I think we see this in immigration too, that Republicans benefited for literally 4 decades for making this an issue, but an issue that they never actually really truly deliver on.
Yeah.
And if they ever deliver on it, they will demotivate their most motivated religious base. And then they'd have to deal with other problems around that. Well, now under Dobbs, this is great for both sides because the Republicans don't have to give up their motivation, but now you have a way to push back on Republican rule in red states. And strategically, this leads to a whole bunch of perverse incentives. You want to talk about the problem, but you definitely don't actually want to fix the problem, because if you fix the problem, it is no longer a electoral motivator. And this is like quadruply true on immigration. The only time we've seen immigration reform of any significant mass in the late 20th century was actually under Ronald Reagan. And the reason why he did it was, quite frankly, they realized there was going to be a demographic problem if they didn't do it, even more severe than what we have with the baby boomers leaving the economy. Like, that was a rational calculation by Ronald Reagan. But that also kind of won them the loyalty, as I mentioned earlier, for a long time of a lot of the Latin vote. And that was undone when the contradictions in the Republican Party were pointed out in 2006, when George Bush tried to do another round of kind of compassionate conservative immigration reform, which also polarized the electorate around immigration in a way that it was not before. Now, as a dirty Marxist, I actually don't care if the Democrats really win. I'm just going to say that outright. But I do care about these immigration issues. And one of the things that I just want to point out to people why I'm really concerned about this tightness in the climate change, this is only going to get worse, because the places most affected by this heat are the places we're getting people from now. And I am one of these people who really does believe that all this immigration from like North Africa and from like Central America, a lot of it in Central America case has to do with the drug trade. We can talk about that. You and I both really know a whole ton about this. But a lot of this also has to do with the increasing difficulty of traditional cropping methods under climate change in these economies. And between those two things together, it's kind of a perfect storm. And one of the reasons why I mentioned Fareed Zakaria is there is actually a rational truth to the fact that, like, that right now the United States actually is having a demographic problem on getting enough workers to not have to pay out the wazoo to keep workers employed, etc. AI LLMs may take some of that stress off, but it's not going to take a lot of it in labor intensive professions, because that's more about, that can more make, white collar professions more efficient. But
not going to replace home healthcare workers, though.
Right, exactly. And we're about to see a major crisis in about a month in regards to this, or actually when this comes out, it should start to happen, where all these subsidies for home healthcare workers and whatnot are going to go away, and daycares are going to go away. But we're already dealing with astronomical daycare prices now. And so we're going to lose even more female workers from the workplace, more than likely to childcare, because it's astronomically expensive. Now, in my perfect socialist world, we could fix that, but we don't live in my perfect socialist world. So this leads us in a pretty interesting situation. And yet immigration is now seen as so toxic that even for economic reasons, they don't seem to be willing to pick this up, which I do think, like, to me, this is a weird game of chicken that I didn't predict. That, like, yeah. What do you think about that?
No, yeah. So, like, to first of all, to like just validate like the climate change piece of this, like, it is absolutely. I'm on that same train. It's just like I think that climate change is going to be the increasingly like the single biggest push factor globally, right? And I don't mean that in like it's going to get hot hot everywhere and everybody's going to leave, right? No, but like there's all kinds of other conflicts that arise and crop up around climate change related events. And to give a small example, like I was on a call this last week actually where there was a whole bunch of NGOs together talking about how the fuck are we going to be able to like squeeze US asylum law to try to fit people displaced by climate change, right? Because the law just does not, like, it's already shit and it wasn't set up for a lot of the kinds of folks that are coming now. It's certainly not going to handle, you know, like accommodate in any meaningful way like people displaced by climate change. But like, for example, like in Honduras, right, like you have stuff like a hurricane come through, wreck a coastal economy. What ends up happening, I just recently found out, is like on the back end of that is that with the local, you know, agriculture economy decimated, cartels are coming in, clear cutting, like displacing people from land, clear cutting massive things to start, you know, either planting other things or even just raising cattle fronts for other portions of the drug trade, of other criminal enterprises, right? So all that to say is that like, but for climate change wrecking those spots in the first place, you don't have all of the other stuff that then comes behind it and further pushes people out of their homes in search of anywhere else, right? And of course, a majority of them are coming this direction.
I mean, one of the things we have to talk about in these shifts here, and I think this is important, like the quote migrant caravans unquote that are coming up from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. These are not people looking for work, actually. Like in the same way that you saw like massive immigration from like Puebla and Oaxaca in southern Mexico in the late 90s after NAFTA and the first wave of this. What's going on now is these are people who are so like these are women and children getting out of an area that is effectively war torn.
Yeah.
While there are maybe a couple of neighborhoods in the United States, I can think of some actually, Skid Row in LA, most of Jackson, Mississippi, that are as dangerous as the general murder rate in, say, Honduras. The murder rate in Honduras is truly astronomical. Like it's really kind of hard to fathom. And it is literally more dangerous than a good deal of war zones. That is something to ponder when you're wondering why like a bunch of desperate women and children with their children up alone are women and children will try to brave Mexico, which is not an easy task, I may add, at all. Like not just braving the crossing the border, braving getting through Mexico is a difficult scenario in and of itself. AMLO has kind of frankly spoken out both ends of his mouth on this. I know it's not popular to criticize AMLO, but I'm going to. And it seems like this is not going to get better. And I can only see the climate change conditions exacerbating this in the next decade. I don't know what to say to do because I also don't like I used to be able, well, you know, we could do a developmental aid to Honduras and from the standpoint of the United States, it wouldn't even be that expensive. Like, but I don't think that's I actually am increasingly of the opinion that that's not really a possibility soon, like to really do that because of the climate change debacles in these places are going to be too bad. So there's no way to turn Honduras into Costa Rica. Yeah. So, you know, like
it'd be lovely if it was.
Yeah, it'd be great, right? And I also could easily foresee like we having another immigration incident out of southern Mexico, although we don't right now, because the Mexican economy is actually decent. And it was even before AMLO. So AMLO's done some good stuff for it. So I mean, like, this is where we can praise him, but it is not a situation like, just put it this way. There are water problems in northern and southern Mexico now. Do you think that's going to go away? Like, these are just things to consider as as we deal with the situation here in North America. And one thing I will say, one thing I've really pushed actually for socialists to start thinking about, we should not, like, I'm big on internationalism, but usually most people's internationalism is far away, frankly, or it's like projecting our hopes and dreams on whatever pink tide is happening in South America, usually somewhat delusionally. Not always, but usually.
Chile's fixed now, right? Like, I mean, like anywhere that's gotten a new constitution is good to go. Like,
and Chile's great. No, Peru totally went well. Things have gone out so well in Argentina. The Peronists have totally swept this up. The left Peronists have totally swept this up. Totally, yeah. And as a person who studies Latin American history, I have seen this before, and I wish the people at Jacobin Magazine would not talk about this on the upswing and not do analysis of it very hard on the downswing. Yeah. But regardless, I do think we have to think of North America as our first, like, you build internationalism with your neighbors, and our neighbors are Mexico, Canada, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Panama, and Costa Rica, and the Bahamas and the Virgin Islands. So it's, and when people talk about like multipolarity or whatever, this is still our sphere of influence under any regime, like any world regime. So we have to have, as a left, a very serious analysis of these states and of how to support these people and how to deal with this. And yes, immigration is a huge part of that. I do think it has to be more than that, frankly. Yeah. Like, I don't think we can stop with immigration, but it worries me because to pivot this back over to you in a question that's almost apocalyptic, I can foresee these tensions over the potential movements of people if climate change continues to accelerate faster than expected over the next 20 years to be nation destroying in all directions. Historically, that kind of movement of peoples, which we have seen historically before, but that's like when all the empires fall and their new empires and weird shit stops happening. Like it like just in the grand array, not just talking about capitalist society. Right. It's like, you start talking about like the 11th century BCE or like the 4th century CE or the 16th century CE. Stuff happens when this kind of stuff happens. And I know that the great powers think that they can just military their way out of that, but I don't know. I'm not sure that 1 million dead bound bodies at the border would even be enough to stop that stuff from happening. No. So it's...
Go ahead. No, I was just gonna say, it's like we're not. You're right. We're not gonna enforce our way. We're not gonna enforce our way to an immigration solution. That much, hopefully, is clear now. Over the last just U.S. history alone. But I think the other point that you raised, right, and I sadly also share a level of apocalypse, because I actually think that these displaced people, and I know that Hannah Arendt is not a Marxist by any means, but I do think that her phrasing here is pretty close to being on point, is that it actually, the refugee and the asylee present an actual fundamental problem to liberal democracy and to conceptions of rights, right? Because what is a citizen if not somebody who belongs in a certain place, which is defined by the people that you keep out, right?
Right.
And so all of these displaced people who no longer have any meaningful state to look to, and are in essence all of those folks, from Honduras, from Guatemala, Salvador, or Afghanistan, right, coming from there and going to Mexico, right? All those people at the border are stateless individuals, and so this this growing body of people literally presents the absence of a solution to the problem of citizenship specifically. It's just there's no way to accommodate including everybody, because you have to define inclusion by what's excluded. So you have to
Absolutely.
define U.S. citizenship by all of the people who are not U.S. citizens. So how do you then fix that? And so it's like this idea again, like there's like universal rights. Well, like in what again that actually bigger concept falls apart in this context. So all I had to say is that like yeah, I think that it presents more than just like a practical economic or even like day-to-day enforcement problem at the border. It actually presents like a much bigger question of like what do you do with people who belong nowhere?
Well, this was the thing about state building as a modernization subject. Stuff that even Marxists were into, and like their discussions of world historical peoples, and then like the national problem, etc. Because on one hand, the workers of the world unite, and on the other hand, we need nations as administrative apparatuses to finish our boost revolutions to make socialism possible. And also, internationalism does actually imply the existence of nations, although by nations we do not necessarily mean nation states.
Right.
All that, for our Marxistly informed audience, is to say, even we don't have a good framework for this, because when you start seeing the breakdown of states in this severe of a way, and you start seeing large groups of effectively stateless people, the administration of universal rights, which is something, by the way, we've never actually believed in. I mean, like, and I say we, yes, America, obviously, because they didn't sign on to the Hague Treaty to enforce the Universal Declaration of Human Rights,
Right.
of which it was one of the primary authors, which is hilarious. But also because we never intended for anyone to uphold the universal human rights, which by formal legal decree, of which the U.S. is a signatory to this, even though we're not a signatory to what enforces it. And I don't know why being a signatory to universal rights even matters, but nonetheless, I've gone through the enumerated human rights recognized by the UN, the international liberal body. No one on earth has ever actually delivered on it, including like your Scandinavian countries. Like, there's supposed to be freedom of movement, relative freedom of movement and marriage everywhere on the planet, and that is not the case. And I could go through the other ones that were clearly in violation. And remember, when the U.S. drafted this, we still had Jim Crow laws. But it is interesting for me to think, because one of the things that this points out to me is like the liberal dream of universal human rights and universal rights as recognized in a legal regime is administratively impossible. And it becomes very clear by stuff like this that we never actually meant it.
Yeah, it was
like
dead
at
on
all.
arrival.
Yeah,
Dead on arrival. Like
it was a lie from the beginning. Like,
and couldn't and can't. I mean, and to your point, right? It's like it's hard to conceive of an alternative, because that is how much that idea has taken root, and at the same time how empty it really is.
Yeah, you start talking about the critique, because I do. I'm not. People say this and they think I'm some like neo-reactionary, but I'm like, look, human rights, the entire framework of human rights has always been incoherent. Particularly when you're justifying it both on natural laws, it was traditionally justified, and utilitarianism, which are directly opposed, even though they're both liberal frameworks of understanding the world. But beyond even that, we have only ever recognized them in their breach. Like, and it's in some ways designed to be recognized in the breach, because the protectors and enforcers of human rights in a given nation is the nation of which you have to be a citizen to get that. Now, in the United States, we have this weird legal code where some rights go to everybody who happens to be here, like legal residents, etc., and some rights do not. And then we have places like the border crossing where no one has any rights, including U.S. citizens. So it is something that, if you really think about it, one of the reasons why the immigration crisis seems more for liberal states than just a practical matter is that it actually exposes fundamental and deeply rooted contradictions in the entire concept of the liberal nation state. And before us Marxists get all haughty about that, we don't really have an answer to it either. So
Right, and and I think that like even in a socialist world, right, you're still gonna run up against this problem of like to use a Gambian terms, like sovereign and bare life kind of situation, where it's like, how do you establish something that has the authoritative ability to protect and enforce rights that also doesn't have the ability to restrict and remove them?
which you don't.
Yeah,
It,
and so the liberal trade-off to that is that we're going to pretend that we believe this when we don't, right?
right.
And that practically speaking is not going to ever come about. But now, like you're saying, right, like these escalating crises expose that lie and also expose the fact that no one has an alternative. And so like to again to tea leaf forecast, like I suspect what's going to start happening is that states like the US, right, are going to push the enforcement piece off of themselves onto other countries where it's easier to bottleneck. So like Mexico is in a great position to basically be the new US border all on the south because it's such a narrow piece of land
Right.
down there, right? And so if you can just get Mexico to do that part for you, you're probably like in the US eyes like less of an issue now. Right now, what'll happen, I'm sure there will be plenty of other things that grow out of that. But at any rate, right, like I think this is why the Dems suck at this even more than they should, is just that like they're unwilling to just buck up and admit, right, that it's like we don't have a solution for this because there isn't a good one or there isn't an easy one, and all of them hurt. What are we going to pick? And so I think that also actually has historically probably been an accurate degree, and maybe that's why like a Reagan is able to actually get something done, is because I don't have to sell this idea to gain electoral points if we can actually manage to bring about a positive boost on the back end of things. And
Yeah, if we can.
it won't be seen as just another liberal gesture towards humanism or whatever.
Right, exactly. It's another Nixon to China moment, to use a cliche, but I mean it really is. Conversely, which is why the heating up the immigration debate really starts with NAFTA and not with the economic and immigration reforms in the 80s, because one comes from a uh, a Republican president and I believe a Democratic Congress, but and the other comes from a Republican Congress, but a Democratic president under actually executive prerogative for the most part. And so this becomes really clearly a kind of big issue. And I want to say a little bit uh, on this, on the difficulties of this. Um, I've looked at the immigration studies under capital. It does seem like on margin there are advantages to the overall economy that to fairly significant immigration, but there has been a lie perpetuated by the Democrats about the fact that it didn't hurt certain kinds of people, or that just like say white workers don't want these jobs, or et cetera. It's like, well, no, the white workers don't want these jobs because they're literally paid less than minimum wage, and you can't even give them these jobs, or like, or they can't socially reproduce themselves in the same way. Whereas now we're leveraging the difference in cost between a very poor country and a very rich country in both directions.
Yeah.
And so it's not just like, oh, rich white people and even black people don't want these jobs. It's like, no, they're only viable because of the differences in uneven development and the in the global population. One thing I would like to add to that is that world, now China's having its own problems right now. People always get mad at me when I say China's having problems, but it has like a 19% youth unemployment rate right now. It does have problems, but in a very real sense, China is no longer going to be the outsourcing for a lot of this labor and a lot of hiding the the costs that have been done mainly through cheap Chinese production in the 80s, 90s, and aughts. And so a lot of these economic contradictions are going to come to a head very quickly where they've been hidden in the past. Just like how Brexit really proved that the only reason England had a viable economy in Europe was that it was leveraging the difference in the money laundering worth of the pound versus the cost of Polish and Estonian people coming in to do all the cheap labor in the UK. And Brexit ended that, but it also made the economy immediately a basket case by ending it, because it always kind of was. And it was just even more than the US, because the UK wasn't a productive economy, the leveraging of this Eastern European labor that led to the Brexit backlash itself, in a very real sense, was holding the economy together. But it's holding the economy together partly by suppressing wages, and that's real. Socialists, if we want to deal with this, we have to admit that just saying, well, overall it's a benefit to the economy, when we're also trying to benefit working people, is a lie. Yes, it is an overall benefit to the economy, but for whom is an entirely different thing. And that has led to a lot of reaction. I think that's why I both care about immigration, but I also think we have to be very honest about this and yeah, we can do this, and we can do it without an expense to an American worker, but we have to completely reorganize the economy for it not to be a huge expense to the American worker. We can do it. We have the power, we have the capacity, we have the materials. We really do. It may probably take a decade to do, but we could do it, but we're not. So, and that's the thing. And even socialists have this is one of my frustrations with Bernie Sanders. And you're talking out of both ends of your mouth on this. Bernie Sanders is not, would push back on immigration. Actually, I think people, then occasionally he get cornered and then he kind of liberalize on it.
Yeah.
But I'd be like, I was always like, no, we have to really talk about how radically we have to think about the structure of the economy, because we actually do need this labor. Ultimately, we do. And while at one time I would have said, let's invest in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. Fuck, we kind of owe them reparations. Don't call them that because I will the backlash. But invest in them, also empower them to administer it. I know there's some corruption, but it's worth dealing with so that they don't get seen as American stooge states. Yeah. And do that for our own stability. That's what I would have said 10 years ago. And like I said earlier, I don't think that's a possibility now. I don't think that would be enough. I think the damage is so much done in some of these areas that people leaving them is going to be how it's resolved. How do we handle that? And I think you're absolutely right. We're hoping to outsource the dirty work, not even to the Border Patrol anymore. We're hoping to outsource it to Mexican Border Patrol and maybe even Mexican cartels, if we're honest.
Yeah.
So,
and we've already started. That relationship has been there for a while, and the U.S. will. Tea leaves, but I am with fair amount of certainty there will be an increase in amount of pressure from the U.S. from Mexico to make the amount of people coming Mexico's problem, right? Figure out a way to make this Mexico's problem, because I think you're also right about the aid piece, right? There is no spending our way out of this, at least not in any kind of short term, and I say short term a decade sort of horizon, right? There will be no spending our way out of it. But I think the other thing too is in terms of radical reorganization, right? I think that also is sort of what ties this back into international socialist struggle, is that there is a fix for it. It's that the way that stuff is set up right now is just untenable, right? And so to go back to the labor piece, it's yeah, Americans don't want to take this job because the pay is shit. Well, the pay is shit because it has to be that in order to sustain the lower cost of food and all of that other stuff, which even now, right, is increasingly not enough for families anymore. And so it all just comes round full circle that way of we depend on exploitation. the exploitation still pays the bills elsewhere, so people are going to keep coming, even though they know that, you know, the conditions are shit. And conversely, then that becomes a conservative talking point when we're talking about taking jobs from people, and, you know, the whole system just gets reconstituted over and over and over again along those lines, until, again, like, there's literally, and I don't know what I'm terrified to think of, like, what the actual break point is with all of this. But even just large scale, like a Reagan amnesty would not fix this anymore. There's just too many other things happening, right? And then you interweave stuff like the uptick in fentanyl and how that's moving across the border now. Again, just like the number of globally displaced people that are finding a way to make it to the States. You know, the amount of, like, Ukrainian citizens, just to use a really small example, like, shot up tremendously in terms of those traveling to Central America to try to make border crossings. Then something that, like, you know, 50, 100 years ago would not have, it just practically speaking would have been very difficult for large amounts of people to move all the way across the globe to try to resettle, is now, practically speaking, is very much a reality, right?
A suitcase and $1,000. I said this, haven't done it myself. It's a suitcase and $1,000. Like, it may be cheaper to that depending on where you're from. So, like, and no, you can't get into the U.S. like by that airplane, but you can definitely get into Honduras, Guatemala City, maybe even Mexico. Like, it's not, you know, think about all those Haitians coming up through Mexico, for example. Like, it's not expensive anymore in the same way. And yes, the TSA has an international, like, border regime, literally kind of established by the TSA. That's a whole different topic we can talk about one day. I used to deal with it all the time. But in a very real sense, like, there's only so much they can actually do, particularly now that things are kind of decoupling. One thing I want to emphasize, you know, people are like, oh, multipolarity. I'm like, multipolarity isn't going to solve this. Like, Central America, no matter what, is the U.S. sphere of influence. It is. Like, there might be plays in South America to go to China stuff. And yes, a lot of these countries are going to try to trade with China in so much that they can. But they don't have a big enough economy a lot of times to be able to really leverage that in any meaningful sense. Like, Costa Rica maybe can, Panama maybe can, Mexico can, but, like, El Salvador cannot. Honduras cannot. Guatemala cannot. It's like, we have to be realistic here. And you know, my stance as a socialist is like, well, historically we fucked this up. And this is very much us who fucked this up. And we've historically fucked around with these countries going all the way back to right after the Civil War, and directly and indirectly since the establishment of the Monroe Doctrine.
Right.
Now, sometimes that helped nations out. Like, you know, we fought a war with Mexico and then reestablished the president that we fought later on when the French meshed with them. But it was very much like, that's our bullied neighbor.
Right.
Europeans don't get to do that. Only we do.
Exactly. That's my little brother. You can't pick on him.
Right. Exactly. It's like, we can fuck with Mexico. You can't fuck with Mexico, France. Like, yeah. But and so I've studied Mexican history in Mexico when I lived there, and it was not as a student, as I was a teacher, but I would go and listen to lectures on Mexican history and U.S.-Mexican relations, which is very interesting as an American, because there's a lot you realize that, like, I was kind of told this in a footnote in school once, right, but, like, not really. You know. And now that I live in the West as opposed to when I lived in the South, it's even more, it's very much a living history. Like, you know, I live in Utah, which was an uninhabited, weird separatist state that was settler colonialized by Spain, and then a bunch of LDS came in to like take it over because they didn't think Spain really wanted it because they didn't establish a mission here. And then like later on, as acquired by the U.S. in the Mexican-American War, and the other part that I like to, I like to remind people, all this was stolen. Even when you're talking about us stealing it from Mexico, it was also stolen indigenous land when Mexico took it, just to remind you.
Yeah.
Not
nicely either. Like,
yeah, no.
Just casually, like, can we have this?
No, it was not. It was not like the Mexicans were better on their settler colonial policy. They were a little better after, I think, after second independence or like, depending on what you're talking about. But like, just to remind you, literally the Spanish Inquisition was unleashed on indigenous people. That Spanish Inquisition really was brought to the Americas and unleashed on Quiche Mayan and other Nahua speakers and all that. Like, so don't think that everyone's nice in that history, but that's not the focus of our thing today. And also, most people who tell you that usually do that to try to excuse U.S. atrocities, and that's not what I'm here to do. My point is that like this is a history that Americans generally don't know, and they have some inkling of it now because it kind of makes the news media. Like, I think people kind of know a little bit that some of what's messed up with Central America has to do with their cartels, and somehow that has something to do with us.
Yeah,
like
vaguely,
vaguely, like, probably because they sell it here, right? Like, but I don't think people know the extent of it, how it's tied into border policy. Like, I always talk about, like, hey, the Zetas were trained at the Border Patrol School of the Americas in Fort Benning, and like,
which is still there, by the way. Like,
yeah, it's just renamed itself. Like, they did change the name because it got so infamous in the late '90s. But that's all they did. Yeah. Like, and no one's ever paid any price for that, except for maybe the Zetas themselves when El Chapo got them. And then, oh, you wonder why it took us so long to get El Chapo? I wonder, maybe it was because, like, I'm not going to get conspiratorial, but there are times where I'm like, we go after certain narco figures at certain times for particular reasons. Like, and I think that's something that we have to just admit, that U.S. foreign policy in our immediate neighbors, except for Canada, is tied into narco policy, which is also part of why we can't totally end the drug war. Like, because it's actually part of our foreign policy apparatus at this point.
Yeah. And even like the inadvertent thing, like, we obviously, like, there's a rich sort of fucked history around the entire like drug crime, world, the gang world, that's just absolutely decimating Central America. But it's like we literally transplanted the gang problem to Central America. Like, we rounded all of those young men up, disassociated young men who had just, started to find some level of identity in local, gangs, and then deported them back to their homes, where they took that and ran with it. And have made all those folks
in the aftermath of juntas and civil wars, of which we sponsored Sizen to fight communism. Like, this is like, just to remind people, that's how that happened. Like, during these pushbacks on these very like authoritarian pseudo-colonial nation states in Latin America that started getting indigenous put back by the brutality of their liberalization process, often held together by our own corporations, the biggest one being the bananas. I mean, that's what the Banana Republic literally comes from. But just in general, then when there's indigenous pushback to that, we empower right-wing juntas in those areas to fight the communists through the Cold War apparatus. And then when we deport all these people who got inducted into U.S. gang culture, which tied into our own impoverishment of our own cities, that they came back to broken states where this was the option. And now they learned it from us and took it home. And those states are more broken. Also, there's more, actually, believe it or not, easier ability to get big weapons, and thus the acceleration continues. And I'm not going to say there's no local autonomy. I don't want to take out like all local autonomy. There is a very real way where no matter how you look at this, the United States is a major contributor to these areas. And there's a couple of states that we spared it, and that's Costa Rica and Panama. And why we did that seems complicated. It mostly seems to be about like trade, actually, and the proximity to trade routes there. But I really do think people need to think about that when we talk about why things are so bad in these areas. It's not even just that like, oh, it got economically so bad there, so the gangs were the only option. Well, that's true, but where do you think they learned the gang technology from?
Yeah, literally. So yeah, like to your point, like literally in an inadvertent way, right? By our own material conditions, just in local impoverished neighborhoods, and sending these folks back. But then, like you were saying, like actively training folks at places like Fort Benning in everything from, counterinsurgency to torture, all that good stuff, right? And all of that knowledge just got dispersed far and wide amongst, everything from, again, gangs to the junta leaders that we were trying to get to do the dirty work for us. So anyway, all that to say is that, yeah, obviously this is a huge, like, it is our problem as, it is a U.S. problem.
Both economically and morally.
But to your point, I don't know that like a reparations kind of a approach, like even if tomorrow we were like, hey, we did this, and this, we're going to, pay out boatloads of money. It's not going to upend the international drug trade. It's not going to reverse climate change. And it certainly is not going to make, Abbott and DeSantis stop being awful in their corners of the U.S.
Right. I mean, the biggest thing we could do to upend the international drug trade would be to pull a Portugal. But I'm not going to say that doesn't have a cost, because it does. Varn is not here to lie to you. Yes, I don't really care about weed legalization, but legalizing narcotics would probably lead to less death in the United States, but it would still have a cost. There is no way around that. There is a social cost of that. If I had my way, I would make recreational narcotics not exist anywhere on the planet by magic, but I don't have magic, and not even socialism is going to immediately fix that. So it's just something we have to be honest about. I do think it's worse to have it be illegal. I do think the black market is far worse than a gray market would be, even, and definitely than a white market. But nonetheless, massive narcotics use has social costs. Really, we can look at, even with alcohol, just look at the post-Soviet Russia for the cost of that. Losing 40% of your men really quickly from drinking themselves to death after economic depression is a pretty big traumatic thing. Right. And so, I just want to emphasize, I don't want things to sound hopeless, because I don't think, I do think, for example, we could accommodate these immigrants. We have the space. We have the capacity. We can't accommodate the current way we however organize our economy. We can't. It would be highly unstabilizing, particularly poor workers. But there's no reason it has to be. And I'm not just saying that in like a utopian sense. Like there are very specific things you could do relatively quickly to help with that. Even if it's weird, like resettling people in the middle of Nebraska where there's currently not a city, but like all that would create jobs, that would, you do all kinds of things with that. But we're not doing that because it would be politically unpopular. And right. I do think this is kind of a pushback to my vulgar Marxist tendency to be like, everything's explained economically. I don't actually believe that, because honestly, it can be explained geopolitically, but it can't really be explained purely economically, because right now there actually would be a pretty immediate benefit to the capitalists if we liberalized immigration. It would lower labor costs. It would.
Yeah, I mean,
So
you'd be dumping, huge amounts into the reserve army of labor.
well,
Just
we've been totally okay doing that in the past. That's why we have prisons.
yeah,
Like, like
which is what we pivoted to largely is right. Like, well, in the alternative, like we're just gonna put, and detention centers are growing, right? It's like we're just gonna put all these people in jail because that also, at least in these rural and a lot of them crop up in rural places. So it's like it is sort of like the weird twisted version of what you were saying, right? Is that like we are doing it to some degree. We're just warehousing folks in rural places and creating a
yeah.
small job and a set of serious economic boom.
Instead of private prisons, we're creating private detention centers and place. I fought one in Evanston, Wyoming, because it was for because we won that battle in Utah, believe it or not. And then the ICE decided, well, we're going to do the same thing, but we're doing Evanston. Evanston is an economically depressed city that's countercyclic. The only reason we won that was COVID, and the locals realized that these prisons actually tend to collapse public infrastructure, and a lot of these rural places barely have it. So it's an immediate boon to the economy, but then it actually is a drain later on. And we were able to convince locals of that, but that's hard to convince desperate people. Like, hey, you need jobs right now. Let me tell you, in 5 years, this is actually going to cost you more jobs than it's going to bring in. And in a lot of cases, it absolutely will. But you need jobs right now, and I think it took both that and COVID for us to win that fight, right? Like, and if it was to happen right now under the Biden administration, we wouldn't win it because we wouldn't have the NGOs, and I even doubt we'd get the ACLU on our side, who are major organizers in Wyoming, the way we did then. And my partner played a bigger role in that than me, but we both were very adamant on this. And one of the things that we've seen here is the NGO money for a lot of these like immigrant organizations or even just Latin community organizations has dried up under the Biden administration, turn it back to where we were beginning. And so it is very hard to find the same supports. And because it's not in the news cycle, we can't even find like silly anarchist volunteer bodies.
Yeah, it's
Like,
and because I'm not trying to like skate, like give anybody a pass, but it's like this fight has been going on for so long and the intensity continues to ramp up that I think folks are just burnt out because it's like you said, right? You fight this fight, you get it shut down in Utah, and what do? They turn around and do the exact same thing except in a spot that's twice as hard to do anything about.
yep. And I'm sure they still opened this somewhere. I don't know where they opened this. It was further away from us, but I'm sure they still opened it somewhere. Like, that's the thing. Like, the one thing I learned in fighting this is like, do you guys know that the largest federal landholders and state level landholders in the country are private prison corporations? And part of that has to do with these detention centers, which are not even technically prisons. They're literally like government subsidized real estate organs at this point that own massive amounts of real estate. Like, it's absurd to learn. Like, it's just like it's truly mind opening to do that. Also, I guess people do kind of know that like prison labor is a whole lot of like very cheap end manufacturing internal to the US. It used to be more than it is now. Actually, I think in the aughts was like the high point of this, or something like at that time during the Bush administration, like 1 in 10 things manufactured in the United States touched prison labor hands.
Hmm.
But and while in most states it's not truly slavery, even though slavery is legal, because an exception carved out in the 13th Amendment only for criminals, hence chain gangs, why they were the way they were, hence the rational corner to the new Jim Crow argument. There is some truth to that. The Most states did have reforms where they have to pay prisoners something, but it's like
$2 a day.
$2 a day, $1 a day, like enough to buy like a Twinkie at the commissary like once a week. Maybe it's slightly better than that, but not much. I mean, I've had some family members in prison, so I've heard about this directly. And with these detention centers, there's not even that. like, and which means since it's not economically exploitable, the conditions are going to be even worse. And I know that sounds horrible, but let us remember, as a good Marxist, we know that the only thing worse than being exploited by capitalists is to not have capital and not be exploited by capitalists.
Be ignored by them. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, it's the only good time to not be exploited by capitalists is if you own capital. Like, or if you're their patron in some way, like you're some politician or some petty bourgeois arts project or something. But like, in general, if you get ignored by the capital, it's like when I'll talk to people about this. I'm like, I'm against gentrification, but in most scenarios, if we are honest, under current conditions, if we don't gentrify, what happens to these areas? It's not like they stay good community centers. In most cases, they get cut off from any development, and they turn into squalor. And like that's what happened to my hometown. So like, while I'm utterly against gentrification, just stopping gentrification is not a fix to this, because if you just stop gentrification under current conditions, you are often condemning a community. So like, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And with a lot of these issues, or particularly tied to immigration, as we said, under the paradox of citizenship that emerges out of this, all kinds of paradoxes become immediately obvious when you deal with this. Like, and it's something that I say even Marxists can't deal with. For example, I'm going to pick on Angela Nagle. But Angela Nagle's whole immigration quote, where she like kind of, I think, I'm not going to say her intentions because I don't really know them, but she quotes Marx quote and then drops the end of it, so it means the opposite of what it said. Like, but what Marx is pointing out is like the hostility towards the Irish is unfortunately systemically rational and will lead to a call for increased, suspension of immigration and increased like hostility towards the Irish, but also that like honestly socialists shouldn't support the immigration restrictions for other reasons, because it has reactionary results, and also it actually makes encourages nationalism and the proletariat this easiest for reactionary forces to exploit, which is the other part of the argument she doesn't quote. And I think we have to be more honest about the problems of immigration under capital, but also say like, we can handle this. There are means. But don't let the neoliberals be the person driving the pro-immigration argument, because that's going to be a disaster. And if you think it's bad here, I look at Europe, where this is worse, and left governments are in no position. They're even in a worse position to handle the problem, because and the demographic problems in Europe are worse than ours, because they have never had strong immigration and naturalization policies. So this is something that I think is on the horizon. And what I don't know what's going to happen is I think we're also going to be beginning to see this in East Asia, definitely in Japan and Korea, and probably eventually in China. And I have no idea what China's going to do. Just none. I don't know. Not even going to speculate. China's been a multi-ethnic country before, so I'm not saying it can't. But this is been hard to deal with in Japan, where for both imperialist reasons and for nationalist reasons, and there are good reasons why there's some fear of massive amounts of immigration. At the same time, there's been a real push to try to handle this, because they realize that their population is going to age out, and they're just not going to even exist if they don't handle this in some way. But it hasn't been easy, and it hasn't really happened yet. Same is true in Korea. So I don't just think we're going to see these problems here. I just think when we talk about this, North America is where it's really absurd, because okay, Japan and Korea are small countries, right? They just are, and they have limited resources. We are geographically, even during climate change, in a pretty decent situation. Like, we could be food independent if we wanted to be. We could be energy independent if we wanted to be. We are going to have problems with the green transition because a lot of the early developments of rare minerals are in Russia and China. But we even have some of those. We just don't utilize them. And, you know, we could get some of those from like Bolivia, particularly if we did it honestly. It would be nice. You know, and fairly, we don't have a long history of that. But which is why it might be harder otherwise. But if you look at North America as a whole, we're in a good situation, and yet I think our inability to handle this stuff is going to make us politically unstable, and we can't really utilize that. And we could definitely accommodate a lot of these people. It's not like there's bajillions of people in Central America. It's not geographically large enough, but like it's just something for, I think we really do have to think about it. And I, like you, also think we're going to start using proxy state enforcers the way we do proxy wars. Like, that's what I see is happening. And the real dark part of me that is almost conspiratorial is just like, and we're going to do it in the gray and black market world too. Like it's never going to be formal official policy, and I don't think anyone's going to plan it, but they'll sure as hell turn a blind eye to it.
Right.
And I mean, we kind of already are. Like, you know, we could have done a lot of stuff about this in for example, the narco trade, if we wanted to in the 90s. It could have been done fairly easily back then. Not now.
Yeah. Not nearly as small or contained a problem as it's become.
As depressing as this conversation has now been for the last half an hour, how would you encourage leftists to think about this? Because the one thing I will say, what I've been sort of disappointed in, and I have not always been the best on this myself because I have so many things I care about. This is not something I always talk about. But it does seem like this has kind of fallen off the radar of discussion. And I know people are going to go like, no, people are still talking about it. And I'm going to say, yes, there are a lot of people still talking about this, both in the activist world and in leftist spaces, but they don't have a microphone anymore.
Yeah.
Like, you know, in 2019, you could get 538 or even something like that to talk to immigration activists. That's not happening now. You know, so how could we help, and what are points of possible hope for mitigation of the situation?
Yeah. You know, so I think that like on a very immediate, like tangible level, you know, what you were talking about, like local struggles are like you're like, oh, is there really like something going on here? There absolutely is. Like there are, between detention fights and just, you know, overall struggle, like there's probably something local to you happening where you can pitch in and try to work on like material conditions for folks, immigrants local to you. So there's just that like practical, like activist, if you will, sort of approach. But I think that the other thing that like we need to get fucking serious about is thinking of a positive and I include myself in this, right? Like a positive program around immigration, a radical sort of rethinking about how we can structure, you know, push to restructure the economic situation, and then deal with this problem of like how do we incorporate large numbers of folks into, because again, there will be no enforcing our way out of it. We will push the problem off, we might make some distance, like, but there's not going to be a fix through enforcement. So the question then becomes is like, what do we do with all of these folks? And I think to your point, right, it's like, will it mean that there's you know, a level of like wealth redistribution, or even like some, you know, more radical socialist-y policies around this that might come up? I think those things probably rise and fall together in terms of a solution for immigration. But we don't, it's like, and I say this as someone who's thought about this problem a lot, and I don't have a great solution, is that we also are going to have to start reconceptualizing what it means to be part of a a body politic and not, and what the criteria are for being included, um, as part of like that economic thinking too. And so all that is to say that it's like I do think that we even under just a very like kind of blah, you know, not Bernie-esque sort of world, we could actually do a great deal to accommodate, and to take in large number of folks. The part that I am still hung up on is that I think a lot of folks are rightly concerned about like what the political blowout will be from some kind of large move to restructure both the economy around this issue and ultimately like the legal framework that we use to think about and process folks coming from other countries.
Yeah. And as we said, it's definitely a challenge to the U.S. Constitution, but it's also, I think it's a challenge to like liberal conception of laws, toe court across the board. Not just. This is not just a U.S. constitutional problem. Like, it's also a problem in Mexico. It's also a problem in the Central American countries that we're talking about themselves. Like, as a person who has been, I used to call myself an accidental illegal immigrant, but I've been told that's not kosher even for yourself. So I was an accidental undocumented person because of political circumstances. I came in legally, and stayed my visa, but like was asked to do a job under the auspices of the government illegally under their own law. It's fun. This is
interesting.
I'm not going to say where. Fun things happen in certain gardens, but it led to me being technically an undocumented person for a year. And so, like, for people who go, well, why does Varn care? My partner and I had a discussion about skin in the game, and she was like, well, part of the problem with me and immigration is I don't really have skin in the game. And I was like, yeah, but I have. I don't now, but I really have had skin in the game. And I have, Korean family who married in. Now Koreans who marry Americans get special treatment under immigration services. I don't know if people know that. They do. But I also have friends who are intermarried couples between the border of Mexico and the United States. I have lots of those friends, actually, because I've lived in both Mexico and the U.S., so it tends to happen. For those of you who don't know, there are more U.S. citizens in Mexico than any other place in the world. I know you think we all go to Canada, but actually it's a lot fucking easier to get into Mexico, by the way.
Love you, Jason.
Yeah. I've been one of them. There's whole communities in San Luis Obispo that are mostly gringos.
Towns of expats just hanging out.
That's even before all these people started pissing people off by going and hang out in the hip spots in Mexico City and running the prices up. Don't do that. Go to some place that actually is used to expatriates in Mexico. Come on now. But I used to remember when all these kind of well-off liberals would be like, I'm going to go to Canada if Trump is elected. I'm like, well, if you had real cojones, you go to Mexico because A, they kind of want you, and B, like, that would actually prove you're not racist. Just saying. Like, I mean, it wouldn't actually prove that you weren't racist. You could still be racist if you go to Mexico, but
definitely it would give you a much better card.
Yeah, it's a much stronger card than going to the whiter country. Not to say that Canada's multiculturalism is well known, but their immigration policies are only slightly better than ours.
Yeah.
Which is why it's hard for even us to move there. So like, it's something that I think a lot about. And I would encourage people to try to have real skin in this game. I cannot stand how many things like we have a 5-second memory for in left-wing organizing and even in socialist organizing, and how we might have a memory. And in some ways I'm a contributor to this because I'm also like, I'm super interested in history. I talk about history all the time. I want us to understand our own history, and a lot of times we don't. But sometimes I feel like people know more about 1917 than 1980. And that's a problem. which is not to say you shouldn't understand 1914 to 1917. It is to say that you have a moral responsibility to be intelligent and to study as much as you can personally cultivate. And I do realize we all have different talents, and I do realize we all have different interests, and we don't have to know everything. Don't think I expect all of you to just become constant students. That's not going to be useful for me. But if you're going to talk about this stuff, you should be informed about it. Go read Dan's book. I point that way. I forget that this is married. Go read Dan's book. That is Borderlines, published by Zer0. I believe we accepted it when I was still there.
Yes, you were one of the readers, actually.
Yeah. Because I'm pretty. I read that book after it came out for reasons that we discussed off show, and I'm not willing to discuss on air. I got to the point where I made sure I read the book before and after it came out to make sure it was the same book. I'm not going to mention how many times that happened, but it was more than once. So I've read Dan's book twice, and I couldn't remember if I was like, did I read it twice for me, or did I read it once as a Zer0 reader? But yes, I'm pretty sure I'm one of the people who accepted it. So go out and read it, even though I don't make any money from it anymore, so I can't be accused of being corrupt here, because Zer0 Books hasn't given me a paycheck in 3 years.
Congrats, I guess.
Yeah. Also, by the way, I only ever made £10 for book accepted. So, like, you never gave me that much money.
Okay, people. Yeah.
I can say that now that it's now that I don't
so much work for £10.
Yep. Oh, and yeah, it also, because of the international exchange rate and Brexit, it got less and less valuable. So, like, when I started, that was like $21, and when I ended, it was like $12.
It's just so fucked. Speaking of outsourcing and exploiting, capitalizing on the exchange.
Let's not talk about left-wing publishing, because it's. I make a lot of enemies, and I've worked in that world. And when I say worked, I volunteered in that world because almost nobody who isn't on the top end of it makes any money. So, organizations like Current Affairs magazine only were ever profitable because they were dumping donor money and trust fund money into it. Or for example, my colleagues over at Strange Matters magazine, whom I love, but their editorial staff that cooperatively runs the magazine, I think, forgoes pay so that they can pay their writers, because it's the only way for them to do it. Which is crazy. So I mean, I guess I admire that decision as opposed to the decision that a lot of left-wing magazines take, which is like we pay ourselves and not our writers.
Right. We pocket all of it. But...
Yeah. But still. So now you guys have a little peek into the depressingly hyper-capitalistic world of Marxist publishing.
I could do like a tiny plug, I
was about to ask you to plug just to
No, I appreciate it. Mike Watson and I started a small press where we're going to attempt to do things a little bit differently, including better cuts just for authors and a lot more transparency around how all that works. So anyway, Revol Press, REVOL press.com. We're still, I think it might say that we've recently closed for manuscripts, but shit, send us your stuff, or if you know somebody who's got a good book in them, we are really hoping to try to adjust the culture around left publishing in our own little corner of the world anyway.
Yep. As much as I hate to be an endorser of Petit Bourgeois projects, as a person who is currently on a Petit Bourgeois project, I have to say, anytime you can do this ethically, it's better. It's more rewarding. I can say that. Like, I don't have Varn blog doesn't have a bunch of interns. Do you know why? Because I don't believe in not paying people. So,
fair enough.
Not to call any other people out specifically, but that's why. And honestly, the economics of a lot of these beers, if you're trying to support a staff on like a Patreon, there's power law, if you're a certain kind of podcast who came in at the right time, you can go buy houses in Silver Lake and pay your staff all honestly. Not gonna name who that is, but people who know. And there's nothing wrong with that. Even it's just timing. But if you're one of these people who come in later, even if you have a big name, you often do not have the capacity off of Patreon donations to actually have more than one or two people on your staff and pay them anything like fairly. So it's the way that goes. So all of you who are thinking you can make influencer money, by the way, influencer money also most influencers don't make, off of podcasting, I hate to tell you that ship has sailed if it was ever real in the first place. But yes, support. Did it again. All right. I'm going to get both of them. For listeners who I'm for people just listening to this, I'm just screwing up pointing to Dan. Support Revo Press. Support small presses in general. Yes, they're petite bourgeois, but petite bourgeois projects, some are better than others. And I would also add to that I really do wish people would support a more viable and ethical model of left-wing publications, because as a person who more or less quit writing articles because I got sick of writing articles for free,
which is pretty much the only way to get published is to do it for free.
Right. I mean, I'm willing to do that for poetry. By the way, for people who go, but don't you publish poetry? Yeah. And also, the poetry market's so bad that unless you're an established name, and kind of like myself, you have to pay to be rejected, which is ridiculous. But I'm willing to do it for poetry because I know nobody's making a whole lot of money off poetry. So unless I guess you're Billy Collins or somebody, but even I don't think he's making a whole lot of money. But maybe Rupi Kaur. Maybe Rupi Kaur's made Silver Lake money off of poetry. I don't know. But in general, most people haven't made that, so I'll do it for that. But I'm not doing it for left-wing articles because I don't want the whole art, like the idea that those of us who are fighting exploitation have to literally submit ourselves to exploitative conditions to advocate for anything just seems absurd to me.
Extra fucked.
Yeah. Particularly when most of the left-wing publications are businesses, and some of them are multi-million-dollar businesses. There are some left-wing publication houses that used to be party presses, even that are now multi-million-dollar presses with ties to major, corporate industries. I mean, the most obvious one is Verso, which this distributor is like Penguin Random House, and they started off as I think it was New Left Press, and they had some ties to British sectarian movements, but it's a completely corporate gig now, which is not to say that there aren't good left-wing people editing there. There are, and it's not to say there aren't sometimes great books coming out there. There are, but there is the reality of this market scenario. So if someone like Revo Press comes out, then you should support them if you can. And so I'd like to thank Dan for coming on. Check out his press. If submissions are open or when they become open again and you're a writer and you want to get your foothold in this world, it's probably going to be new presses are a good way to start. As a person who has literally been publishing poetry books off of the New Press bandwagon his entire life, I will totally endorse that. And I think what you guys are trying to do is a niche that's not currently filled. So if you would like to talk a little bit about the mission of the press, actually, before we end the show.
Yeah, we really are hoping to kind of ground the whole thing in based around the author's process, right? And so I think a number of left-wing, and I'm not here to just slander other left-wing publishers, right? I think that folks have taken steps, right? But a couple of the big things that we're trying to do differently is number one, just a better royalty split across the board for authors. But then number two, that is like, we are really hoping to sort of help cultivate, give folks the boost that we got, you know, from, you know, not to blow smokers, but like folks like Varn, you know, I just had so many folks along the way give me little nudges forward in getting the book off the ground, in getting it in front of other people, eyes, stuff, to where it went from, you know, had no support to I got to go on Sam Cedar's show, right? And like, woohoo, whatever. But
which
the
I've
point,
never got to do.
yeah.
So.
I
That's
think
okay. I don't
that's
want
probably
to.
because you're a little too radical.
I was about to say, like, everyone's like, Varn, go on Sam Cedar's show. And I'm like, for what? Why would Sam Cedar undermine his organization?
I was going to say, I don't know. That's a beautiful lose-lose proposition for Sam. So,
I mean, it's even sort of like lose-lose for me, because it's like, and I just lost all my cred forever. I already lose my cred enough by being close friends with a few people in the social democratic sphere that I've just known for like 15 years. And you know, I love them and their allies, even if a lot of times I'm like, it's okay that you're a pinko and not an actual red. I can live with it. I'm okay. Because every now and then someone will say that about me, and it's really funny. They're like, my favorite insult is when people call Varn a social democrat. I'm just like, if by social democrat you mean like August Babel in 1911, maybe, but like in general, no.
I would, yeah. I'm not sure that label has ever cropped up in my mind.
You know, I've been called a lot of other things.
Yeah. Sock dem, not one. All right.
Sock dem is a new one that started only recently, and I've just been like, that's fun. But check out Dan's Press. Check out Borderlines. I really do endorse the book. And guys, follow this immigration stuff. It's really going to matter. I think it's up there with climate change and politically destabilization moves that unfortunately the current geopolitical realignment is kind of put in the background. And I also think the Democrats have been, as we said earlier, and just to reenter this point as we finish, the Democrats have been able to play this both ways. They've been able to be shocked at the, you know, to feign shock at the seeming barbarism of like what Abbott and DeSantis are doing. Not that it hurts Abbott and DeSantis often to do that. It actually helps Abbott and DeSantis with their base, but also to basically continue Republican immigration policies. But because they can point to Abbott and DeSantis as the new face of that, they don't have to change anything or even admit that they've capitulated. And it's great for both sides. You do need to hold people accountable for pushing that, my friends. I do think you should, even if you're a milk toast sock dem, even if you're a Sam Cedar fan. Look, I don't hate Sam Cedar either. My favorite thing that people got mad at me about was like I said, Sam Cedar's just a Democrat, and people got all mad at me, and I was like, look, I'm just saying what Sam says. Like Sam has admitted this. It's not even me. Like he's just a progressive Democrat.
I'm just repeating.
I'm just saying what he has publicly stated he is in the past. So it's just, you know, don't, you know what it reminds me of? And I'm rambling. People forgive me. I'm a little bit hyped up on caffeine right now. But it reminds me of all those people who thought Obama was a rabid anti-war president because of what he said about Afghanistan, and just totally missed that his policy on what he said about Iraq, but his policy on Afghanistan was actually completely consistent the whole time. But people were mad because I think they didn't realize that he was actually telling the truth about his stances, which is, you know, rare for a politician to do. But I just remember going like, you guys made him into this anti-war president. He was only anti the administration of the Iraq war and maybe the timing, but he was not an anti-war president.
Anti-war,
but yeah. And that was, I sometimes feel this way with a lot of like left media figures, but the left media figures are actually very honest about their politics, and yet people read them as more radical because I guess they want them to be, or like radicals sometimes come on their show, or whatever. And I'm like, you know, I'm not even mad about it, like, at all. I think Sam Cedars fine for a progressive Democrat. Like, I actually, you know, kind of like him on the spectrum of that. But, like, I also know what he is. Like, you know, I don't get mad at, like, MSNBC for being MSNBC. I get mad about MSNBC for being full of shit. But, like, I don't get mad at their politics because I know what they are. Like, I never had any delusions about that. And I think that's maybe another thing to remember as a media consumer. Some of the responsibility is to actually, like, listen to what people say and evaluate it not by what you want to believe, but by what is said. And that's what, I don't know. We're way off topic, but thank you, Dan, so much for coming on the show. Friend of the show, Dan Melo, and Mike is also a friend of the show. He's been on the show, although very long time ago. He's kind of in a place where it's a little bit hard to schedule getting him on the show.
Yeah, it's a little tricky. It's been quite the time, like, trying to meet and sort out the press stuff, but we're doing it.
Yeah. Lately, I've been having a lot of guests from New Zealand and Australia, and it's been like, okay, well, I got to stay up till like 11 at night and call them at like 6 in the morning their time, or vice versa. This is the only way this can possibly happen. You know, but I get it. I used to be the guy who was doing a show from either Egypt or South Korea, so you know, it's fun. For those of you who wonder why Varn in the aught teens had a lot of British guests on his show, it was because they were in a closer time zone. Just for if you've ever, like, suspected something there, that was why. So, yeah, just, you know, just it wasn't that, like, I love the British. Running joke that's totally not a joke is that I don't love the British. In fact, I would say I have an irrational prejudice against WAFs, even for, like, you know, not that WAFs are good or anything, but, like, I have an irrational prejudice against WAFs. It's like, Anglo-Saxon Protestants, gross. Anyway, and on that note, I'm going to end the show before I say anything that incriminates me and or Dan. So,
thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on.